Awesome. That was such a great preso to start off with, and I'm just like bubbling with questions for Kath. But before we get into that, I would like to acknowledge the people, the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we meet today. So while Sarah and I are both PhD candidates at RMIT, we also took similar pathways to get to our research. And we both worked in violence prevention spaces in different capacities for a number of years. And so our discussions here also reflect those histories as researchers and practitioners. So earlier in the year, discussing our research projects, we started to identify an overlap where our participants were speaking to similar practices and tensions in how they approach their work in challenging and transforming gender inequalities and the common gaps that we saw in the literature. As we hope to work on some papers regarding these connections, we found the symposium to be opportune to share some of those findings with you all today. So just on some terms, most of you are probably across. What we're talking today is called primary prevention. This includes upstream initiatives aiming to transform the drivers of gendered violence. So in other words, to end gender inequality and violence through social change. So why focus on care? As many here will be familiar, and as the themes of the symposium highlight, care and empathy have become central to scholarly reflections on complex social issues, including gendered violence. We have seen examples in the ongoing work of marginalised communities where emphasising care is a practice that challenges more individualistic approaches to equality. And of course, care has been for a long time an analytical focus within feminist theory, research and philosophy. So with this regard, fun.
Spoilers.
In this regard, examining care in the context of violence prevention is a logical progression. Indeed, care has increasingly centred in work on men, masculinity and gender equality as a counter to patriarchal and violence supportive gender norms. In the literature around primary prevention, however, notions of care still remain imbued in familial, romantic, public health and gendered language. We find these discussions often focus on the individual and as being unhelpful for holistic approaches to structural and normative change, similar to some of the things that Kath was touching on just before. Such language is fostered through the impact and metrics of institutions that employ and fund most services or campaigns. So the ways that our participants have discussed their practices have been more focused on collaboration, sharing and carefully unpacking with recognition of mutual vulnerabilities in everyday scenarios. So we'd like to share those discussions and their thoughts and practices to help conceptualize a collective model of care for primary prevention. We draw upon those working in parallel spaces, including Black and Indigenous, queer and disability scholars who similarly seek to transform normative constructions of care as individualised, transactional or one-sided.
Yeah, thanks, Léna. So as Léna highlighted, we're drawing on data from both of our PhD projects today. So in Léna's case, this was focus groups with young people aged 16 to 25 within Australia who have experienced sharing kind of digital content around preventing gendered violence in different ways. And then from my own PhD today, the data we'll be talking about is from key informant interviews with 23 prevention practitioners who do similar kind of gender transformative work with men and boys in Australia. So as Léna noted, we identified a common thread in our data that centred on this collaborative and feminist approach to care, both as a practice ethic and an objective of primary prevention. And so we find that these cohorts are speaking very much around sort of formal and informal shared everyday experiences, and that's why we're bringing them together here. So we argue that such critical practices can enable us to engage with and care for one another while making space for how we can change gender power structures and do that really challenging work. So it's become somewhat of a trope within the prevention sector to state that everyone has a role to play in ending men's violence, or it's everyone's responsibility to prevent violence against women. But what those roles are, who can take them on, is contested in ways that reflect feminist concerns over gender politics and power, and particularly when it comes to questions about how men might be involved in this space. So bringing our attention to prevention as a form of collective care can help us trouble the kind of assumptions underpinning this individualized language of roles and responsibilities. So the quotes that we share here from Hannah, Mia, and Dinara highlight that part of prevention is about sharing the load. It's offering skills to others, including men, and encouraging support to be ongoing from those who do take up that work. So while often couched in universal terms, prevention is also a type of labour, much like care, and it requires particular expertise in some instances, and there's considerations around the risks if that work isn't done well. And so Mia here argues that prevention work isn't necessarily achievable for everyone, while Dinara points to the significant emotional labour and resilience that this work requires from us. And our participants recognise the various forms of labour that can underpin gender transformation and offered care within their approaches to bringing others on board in this work. Adopting these sentiments, participants position themselves in ways that enable them to collectively challenge unequal gender norms, structures, and relations. So the social reproduction of both violence and the change within primary prevention are cumulative and interlinked in important ways. As Andrea here describes, for example, her approach to challenging rape myths and what contributes to them helps to also unpack that individualized way that many people might think about sexual assault. And starting from these reflexive positions, our participants provided insight into how everyone comes to and might respond to the work of prevention. So unpacking how we are positioned structurally in relation to gendered violence then gives these participants a sense of compassion and understanding and pragmatics for how they frame and relate their knowledge to others. Rachel and Caroline also note that this is a requirement as structural inequality is often blinding. So for these practitioners, it was important to start with acknowledgements of how inequalities can shape everybody's experiences to be able to then go that next step in having those careful conversations in potentially transformative ways. And as I highlighted on the last slide, this is certainly a form of labour. So Michelle's comments indicate, however, that this direct kind of acknowledgement and active challenging isn't always apparent within the sector. And so Michelle felt that in her experience, messaging tended to focus on the why and not the how. And this has implications for how we engage others in that collective work in preventing men's violence. So what comes through really clearly in our work and is well recognised is that the premise of these processes of care within primary prevention work is relationality. To engage with others across differences here also requires acknowledging common ground as a basis for connection and solidarity. And here we see how participants reflected on their relational understandings in approaching engagement, connection, and positionality. So, for example, Frances here illustrates that sense of recognition as a reminder to keep checking their own knowledge and place within the work. For Marinda and Henry, considering their relationship to the evidence and how they share it with others might also require a relinquishing of expertise in particular ways. So this is also a pragmatic strategy for them to be able to get men and others sort of on board in a way that actually matters to them and recognises the complexities of men's lived experiences under patriarchy. So our participants articulated the need to be conscious about how we do this work of engaging to then be able to do that collective unpacking. And in other words, this is a critical reflexivity centred on the relationality of the work. And it's one that creates space for the difficult processes of gender transformation. So for our participants, what's central to preventing violence is establishing a sense of recognition around shared experiences. And certainly the work around sexual ethics comes through here as well. So this connection offers a hook in a way to generate collective care for and investment in transforming gender inequality. And this is particularly important around discussions of men's allyships and engagement with violence prevention. So Andrea again here shares that connecting with someone offers a way for her to both relate to and understand what she's saying. And this recognition kind of serves two purposes in creating compassionate allies while also avoiding potential further backlash. And these connections can form the basis of ongoing solidarity by normalising the work as a project of transformative empathy. And Rachel's comments here speak to this recognition and centering of lived experience within her own work. And like Andrea, this helps to challenge gender inequality while managing that potential resistance. The work of remaining humble and of listening generously requires attention to whether and how empathy and vulnerability are being mobilised in colluding or transformative ways. So as we've articulated caring for prevention today, we argue that it reflects both the practice and objective of this work. And we need to exercise collective care to reach the aim of spreading collective care. This is about offering it to others so that they can offer it in turn. In doing so, we hope to highlight the potential everydayness of preventing men's violence. So if collective care can be an everyday norm, then it's one that everyone can enact. But as feminist and social justice literature shows us, it's also the everydayness that we take for granted and that we need to make more explicit in order to sort of harness potentials for social transformation. As Caroline's
left.
Thank you. You're right. So as Caroline's quote reminds us, violence too is an everyday norm, and transforming such pervasive gender inequality within those kind of norms, structures and relations is a fundamentally difficult and long process. The practitioners that we spoke to, or the participants we spoke to, are intimately aware of those realities. But as Nina comments, it's baby steps, right?
So the feminist literature on care, empathy and solidarity for gender transformative work comes back into focus here. As scholars like Claire Hemmings and Amanda Ketty and others highlight, there are limits to what a pedagogy of empathy can achieve for transforming the power relations of oppression and injustice. In this way, we can think of how institutionalized empathy training has become a political tool for maintaining the status quo. So are we taking care for granted in primary prevention? From our findings, centering collective care is seen as generating agency, solidarity and mobilisation around gendered violence while recognising the political implications in challenging unequal power structures, norms and relations. This helps us to recognise and hopefully reframe ideas about who is more likely to take part. For us, this conceptualisation is lacking from much existing literature on prevention programming. It results in a focus on institutional practices like service delivery, measuring impact, and ensuring self-care or self-preservation. Care as it's practiced by our participants can be contrasted then with the frequent framing of prevention messages as individualised responsibility, where collective solidarity is taken for granted. So what? Returning to our earlier question, what does it mean to draw out existing work on collective care and care ethics for our efforts to engage men and others in preventing gendered violence? Our participants do this work, this challenging work, because they care, and to care in this context is inherently political and pragmatic. To speak of care is to invoke empathy, compassion, and understanding. Though, as we noted, these effective relations must be approached critically to identify how power structures can shape collusion, resistance, and transformation. Certainly then, the current institutional framing of care that some prevention literature uses is one that is both cause and consequence of the structural inequality within a neoliberal service sector. So to consider how structural factors position us in relation to gender inequality, it is vital to identify transformative strategies for us to respond to and prevent violence, providing secure connections to collective care for those resisting violence within communities can then sustain us and those practices while we work towards catalysing non-violent futures. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really great. So interesting to hear about your work. And I think prevention as a form of collective care is really a rich terrain that you're wading into it. It's really great to see. I don't think we have any questions. Anyone? I guess, okay, I'll ask one, because one of the things that when you were talking about, collectivity and the community, and when times are rough, all we have is community, it made me think of how the public service announcements around gender violence have really changed in recent years. And it's less and less typically two people alone in a room, one man, one woman, something happens, it's never okay. And increasingly it's you're shown conversations between friends of like, I remember this one I've seen recently where two young women are talking and one of them receives like a series of harassing texts, and the other one goes, I think one of them goes, he just misses me, exactly, yeah, and the other one goes, no, it's never okay. And I guess would that be a bit of a reflection of what collective care could look like? Of course it's limited because it's on TV and it's only 2 minutes long, or do you see that sitting a bit differently with what you're envisaging?
It's a good question. I guess it certainly hooks into that aspect of someone caring for another, and I think what we're really interested in is how we might kind of expand that imperative to care for the other at a much broader scale. And a lot of the critique around that kind of bystander approach to prevention is how individualized it can become, because it hooks into that language of everyone has this individual responsibility to sort of respond. And I think it's interesting, hooking back to what Kath was talking about as well, around sort of naming the problem isn't enough, and we do so much work around naming the problem, but people know what consent is and people know that you need to establish consent in particular ways, but it's taking it that next step further that I think we feel like this kind of conversation might have a lot of value. I don't know if you want to add to that at all, Léna.
Sorry, I was just looking at a comment in the chat. Yeah, I would say that's definitely like a practice of care for the person who is on the receiving end, right? And so I would say yes to directly to your question there, but also I would say what is care for the person who would be engaging in the sending of the text, so that doesn't happen to be, so that why did that person think that was an okay thing to do? And also, how did they respond to being called out or whatever?
Yeah, it's really interesting because in those PSAs, you're rarely shown what happens next. You see people telling each other it's not okay, it's never okay, but you don't really see how the person reacts.
Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of use of shame and blame around those sorts of actions that are useful from an institutional standpoint to get a message across, but I don't know where that really gets us.
Interesting and difficult comment from Simone in the chat that I'll pass on to you. I'm wondering how young men feel through care practices in certain ways. Do you have anything you want to respond to this one?
Yeah, as Léna said, so yeah, the other kind of component of my PhD that we haven't spoken about today, but I did interview men as well, more of that, the 25 to 40. So not necessarily falling into that cohort of young men, but yeah, there is kind of this emerging literature, maybe not even emerging anymore, but around men and care practices. But the kind of critique again that I think sits with where we're coming from is often the way that care gets talked about, as I think we're probably all quite familiar with, but in the case of men taking on care, or kind of the sense of caring masculinity, is it's not necessarily doing enough to trouble hierarchy and binary ideas about masculinity and femininity, and it sort of hooks into that healthy masculinity discourse or rhetoric that it's still kind of centering men and masculinity and doing these kind of things. But as I say, this isn't about that's not about men's experiences of care so much as the literature.
Yeah. So there were there was maybe 4 or 5 young men who participated in my study, and a couple of them were engaging in like professionally in prevention work. And they had very salient experiences that had led them down that pathway. But pretty much all of the young people had gendered perceptions of who cares and why with regard to other men. And that was really interesting for me, and sort of like part of why I started talking to Sarah about like, what is this thing about care, and why do we talk about it? Why does the literature and prevention messaging talk about it in a different way to like what people are actually doing, and how can we like messy that up a bit?
Thank you so much. We'll stop it there. This was really great, and such a great comment as well to end on, Léna. Thank you.